I was talking about how motherhood is a gift, right? Talking about how the gift of motherhood, the pros and cons, right? Because there are pros and cons to being a mom, right? There are pros and cons. We love being able to talk about all the great things, but I want to talk about both the pros and the cons to make sure this light is not in my face all the way. Talk about the pros and cons to being a mom. So, culture teaches mothers to overperform, to over-sacrifice, and to lose themselves completely, and to carry everything silently, and to measure their worth by exhaustion. But when we study the Bible carefully, we begin to see things a little bit deeper, right? We learn that biblical motherhood is not just about serving others, it's about stewardship. It's about wisdom, it's about nurturing, it's about discipleship, it's about spiritual formation, and it's about love rooted in God, right? Not rooted in self, it's love rooted in God. And so when we talk about motherhood as a stewardship and not as an ownership, one of the first biblical truths about parenting, right, is that children belong to God. They don't belong to you. We are just stewards. They belong to God. This changes everything psychologically and spiritually because many mothers unconsciously carry the pressure of feeling like every outcome in their parenting depends entirely on them when it is not true. Mothers also feel like every mistake that their kids experience is because of them, right? They also feel like they have the need to control every detail perfectly, right? I want my little girl to be perfect. I want my son to be perfect, right? But scripture shows us that mothers are caretakers, right? We're caretakers under God's authority and not God. We're not God to them, right? And that means you're a guide. That means you're a nurturer. That means you teach and you protect, right? But ultimately, God is the one that shapes their destiny, right? That truth relieves some of the crushing pressure that many moms carry, right? In Psalms 127:3, it says, children are an inheritance from the Lord, right? This verse actually reframes children as entrusted gifts to us, right? They're not possessions to control. They're gifts. It is our job to steward them, right? So many women, right, and many moms confuse biblical sacrifice with self-neglect. But Jesus consistently models something important. He served others, right? But he also took time to withdraw, to rest, to pray, and to replenish, right? And that matters because mothers feel guilty sometimes for resting. You know, I've been guilty of that. How many of y'all been a mom where sometimes you just feel guilty for resting because you feel like, or you have gotten to a point sometimes in your life where you feel like resting was off the table, that you're supposed to be going 100% all the time and never taking time to really rest, right? And sometimes we feel guilty for needing solitude. Let me tell you something. Sometimes you need solitude, right? Sometimes you need time to take and just sit. And, before you had to be in the corner because you got in trouble. Now you want to be in the corner so you can have a little bit of solitude, right? And sometimes we feel guilty for setting boundaries, right? And feeling emotionally tired, right? But exhaustion is not proof of righteousness, is not proof that you're a good mom. The Bible teaches us balance between resting and serving, right? And when you're parenting your children, you're serving, right? In Mark 6:31, it says, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Even in ministry, right? Rest is acknowledged as much as necessary, right? So likewise in parenting, right? Rest is just as important, right, when you're parenting as it is in anything else that you do, right? Many women read Proverbs 31 and they feel pressure, right? Instead of using it as a book of wisdom, they feel pressure because the passage is not representing, Proverbs 31 is not presenting a superhuman, not a superwoman who never gets tired. It's presenting a woman who's wise, who's intentional, who's spiritually grounded, right? And wise is important to understand because she was strategic, right? It showed that she was discerning, she was resourceful, and that she was economically aware and spiritually strong. right? She maintained her identity and her wisdom and her capability. Biblical womanhood was never meant to reduce women to exhaustion, right? Proverbs 30 to Proverbs 31 woman, she delegated. That's important to understand. She delegated, right? She managed. She had plans. She built. She spoke wisdom. She invested, right? She also created, right? This is not a passive thing that she did. It was an empowered form of stewardship, right? The Bible doesn't hide the emotional struggles of moms, right? We can see all throughout the Bible, we can see grief, right? We see fear, we see exhaustion, we see mistakes, emotional pain, and even desperation, right? And this matters because modern day motherhood often pressures women to appear emotionally flawless. But scripture presents mothers as human beings who need God too. We need God too, right? And some examples of women that have gone through that have experienced some of this grief and fear and exhaustions was Hannah. Hannah experienced deep emotional anguish, longing before she became a mom. She was longing for a kid. And her story reveals that motherhood and emotional pain can coexist, right? Let's look at Mary. Mary carried the emotional burden of raising Jesus while enduring misunderstanding, being misunderstood, by dealing with fear, and eventually having to watch him suffer. How many of you as parents have had to watch your children suffer because of disobedience or because of something that they're going through that you totally feel helpless, right? You start to feel like, man, there's an emotional burden that comes with that, right? One of the most dangerous distortions in motherhood is believing that a good mother suffers endlessly. And that's not always true, right? Biblically, suffering itself is not the goal, right? Love is the goal. Wisdom is the goal. Faithfulness is the goal. Motherhood includes understanding our human limits. Even God himself established rhythms of rest, right? That's why we have the Sabbath, right? So chronic burnout should not become a badge of spiritual honor. You walking around extremely exhausted is not a badge of honor, right? Biblical parenting is deeply connected to modeling. And you might be thinking, to like modeling what, right? Children absorb emotional patterns, right? They watch you when you snapping over every little thing. They watch you when you get all worked up and cussing folk out because you feel like they got on your everlasting nerves, right? They absorb emotional patterns. They watch you, right? When you are overwhelmed because you're overstimulated, right? They watch how you respond to tribulations, right? They watch how you respond to disappointment, right? They watch how you respond to anger, right? They watch how you respond. They also absorb reactions. They absorb spiritual habits. So if they see that when you go through something that you get on your knees and you pray, right, it encourages them to do the same thing, right? That when they go through something, they have the desire to pray, right? And this is a little Mother's Day encouragement for some of your moms that may be watching, or moms to be. Children absorb self-worth models. That means if you don't value who you are, then guess what? Your children are not going to value who they are because they're going to watch you and you're going to be their model, right? Children absorb relational behaviors, right? If they always watch you in toxic relationships, then guess what? They learn to be in toxic relationships, right? When a mother consistently neglects herself, then children unconsciously learn that love equals depletion and that women must over-sacrifice, right? And that rest is guilt, right? They learn that identity is not important, right? But when they observe healthy boundaries and emotional honesty, and then when they watch you depend on God, when you have dependence on God, then they begin to see the wisdom and they begin to see rest and peace as the foundation for life, right? One of the deepest biblical truths about motherhood is motherhood exposes your human limitation. I'm sorry to say, but you bleed like everybody else. You are not a robot. Motherhood exposes impatience, How do I know that? When you start cussing your kids out, when they get on your everlasting nerve, you start cussing them out, right? And going off on them. Motherhood exposes impatience. It exposes fear, right? It exposes emotional weakness. It also exposes lack of control. You snapping at everything that's not going your way. It exposes that. It also exposes exhaustion. And this is important spiritually because motherhood often brings women face to face with their need for grace too. We need grace too. If you're a mom, you need grace too. Not perfection. Grace. The Bible never teaches us to be perfect mothers, right? It teaches us dependence on God. It teaches us wisdom. It teaches us humility. It teaches us love and perseverance and faithfulness, right? A mother's value is not based on how exhausted she is. I don't care how much the world tries to convince you of that. A mother's value is not based on how much she suffers silently. A mother's value is not how perfectly she performs her duties as a mom, right? Her value comes from being created in the image of God. Before she's a mother, she's still a human being. And her identity matters also, right? Biblical motherhood is not about disappearing. It's not about It's about nurturing wisely while remaining rooted in God. It is love without losing truth. How many of you have had to tell your children, had to give them the hard truth, and it didn't always feel so great, right? I gave an example where my son at one time did something that was just totally disrespectful, and because I had other kids in the house, I had to respond with extreme measures of tough love to show the other children in the house that this was not acceptable, right? Sacrifice, when you realize that sacrifice without self, meaning that you can sacrifice without self-destruction, right? You can nurture without abandoning yourself, right? You can nurture your children and still walk in who God created you to be. You can still nurture your children. You can still serve, right? While remaining spiritually connected. You can still be a mom and be spiritually connected, right? One of the most important lessons that scripture teaches us mothers is you were meant to carry motherhood alone. And that's not true. You were never meant to carry motherhood alone, not emotionally, not spiritually, and not mentally, right? God did not call mothers to be perfect. He called them to be faithfully dependent on him. And when he's called us to be faithfully dependent on him, that means you have to rest in him, right? That means you have to sit and rest, right? One of the first biblical truths about parenting is children, like I said, children belong to the Lord. So when you're raising your children, you have to realize that you are stewards. Right? So you can parent them and teach them what's right. The Bible says it's our job to train them in the way that they should go. So training them involves a lot of things. Training them involves teaching them the right way of how to do things, right? Teaching them how to balance, right? How to live, how to live in this life according to the word of God, right? Motherhood begins. One of the things I wanted to also share is that motherhood, when you become a mother, it begins in your body, right? Before the emotional sacrifice comes, the physical surrender is what happens first, right? Why? Because your body becomes the shelter for your children. You become the shelter. You become the nourishment if you breastfeed. You become the protection. You become the survival system, right? And even after birth, your body no longer belongs fully to yourself because your sleep is interrupted, right? Your nervous system is always on high alert, right? Especially if you got active kids. Your hormones are always fluctuating. Your physical energy becomes divided among people. If you're married, you have to divide that energy between your kids and your husband, right? Many moms live in prolonged exhaustion for years, not just temporary tiredness. There's a difference between being temporarily tired and being exhausted for a prolonged amount of years, right? It's a difference between being chronically depleted, right? And the danger of being chronically depleted is that eventually the body stops signaling distress, right? And you become accustomed to exhaustion, and that survival mode that you're in starts to feel normal, right? Over time, consistent physical sacrifice can become burnout, It can become adrenal fatigue. It can become emotional instability, right? Most of the time, when you see people who snapping all the time, it's because they're fatigued. They're tired. They're mentally and physically exhausted. When you see a person exhausted and they just snapping, biting people's heads off, it's because they ain't got no. Because they feel they're fatigued, right? Their immune is being suppressed. They have brain fog. They walk around in resentment, right? And sometimes they just plain numb. And how do you know when a person is numb? Is when your children start talking to you and you do what we call zoning out, where you be over here looking to the side and they talking and you have completely disconnected, right? Mothers are often expected to keep going, and many women stop listening to their own bodies entirely. Sometimes that's why you see people they just drop. I remember, this is kind of funny. It wasn't funny at the time. But sometimes you can just be so tired and you don't listen to your body and you just try to keep pushing and keep going. You ever notice that your eyes you will just black out and your eyes will just close for you? Look, we trying to let you manage this ship, but you ain't doing a good job managing the ship. So because you're not doing a good job with this ship, we going to shut down. And then you wind up somewhere and you just be conked out and you didn't realize you fell asleep, right? That's because you forgot that you've been trained to keep going, and then you stop listening to your body. When your body say it's time for us to go to sleep, you try to push it because you feel like I got to keep going, right? This is where motherhood becomes psychologically complex, right? Because mothers often not only carry for their children, right? They not only care for their children physically, but they also care for them emotionally, right? And they're emotionally regulating the entire environment. When you think about a mom, right? When they say happy wife, happy life, I believe that came from mothers being in a position of setting the environment in a home, right? When you set the environment in your home, your kids feel safe. When you are calm and you create an environment of calmness and peace, then your kids start to become like that. They become peaceful. They feel safe. You provide a safe environment, right? Many mothers become emotional absorbers, peacemakers, emotional stabilizers, and protectors of the household atmosphere, which means mothers often suppress their own emotions in order to maintain emotional safety for everyone else. They swallow their own anger. They swallow disappointment, loneliness, frustration, and fear. That's why you can look at a mother. You can tell she's swallowing her frustration because she got to form that lip thing like, you don't sit down somewhere, I'm going to get your behind, right? Because you're suppressing your frustration, right? Because you're trying to maintain an atmosphere of peace and sit your behind down somewhere. You're trying to maintain that environment to sit your behind down somewhere, right? Because you feel responsible for keeping the emotional structure of the family intact. Sometimes when you got one of them kids and they just look like they just lost their everlasting mind and you just want to smack them, right? But you just maintain peace because you want to maintain the environment so the other kids don't get uptight, right? So what happens when you suppress yourself too long, right? So you think that when you suppress your emotions, they just disappear. No, they transform, right? They transform into irritability, right? So when you suppress your emotions, it turns into anxiety. Then you become emotionally detached. What does that look like? That means your kids could be talking to you and you like, boy, go sit down somewhere. Girl, go somewhere and sit down. Go to bed, right? Go to bed. You're emotionally detached. Your kids hug you and you push them away because you're mad. You got stuff to do. You got deadlines and you're emotionally detached. Go sit down some doggone where. Go to bed, right? You're passively resentful, which means you feel overwhelmed about being a mom because you feel like maybe the father is not involved. Maybe the father is not there to support. So there's a passive resentment, right? You might feel like emotional. You might feel like it might turn into emotional shutdown, right? Which means it's funny because there was a video here on TikTok. And the video on TikTok, the people were saying the mom was like up against the refrigerator and she was like, but then the kid would come for her to sign a slip and she would just have to get herself together to sign a slip. And then she would go into a meltdown and then another kid would come with something else that they need. And she was so overwhelmed that she felt like she couldn't, she was on an emotional shutdown. So her emotions were suppressed, and it transformed into depression. It transformed to being overly stimulated. And boy, do I know what that feels like, right? And this is why some mothers eventually say, I don't even recognize myself no more. Because emotionally, they have spent years prioritizing everyone else's feelings while abandoning their own emotional feelings, right? This is one of the deepest sacrifice mothers can demand, right? Motherhood often changes how a woman is seen by the world. Because before you became a mother, you might have been seen as an individual, right? Before you was a mother, you were seen as a creative. You were seen as a person that was about her business, right? You were ambitious. Before you were a mother, you had personality. You might have been the life of the crowd, right? You might have had dreams, right? But after motherhood, many women begin to privately be identified by what they provide. And so slowly their identity becomes functions instead of personal. Like you ever be in a place and people be like, they never ask you how you doing. They always be like, how the kids doing? And you be like, oh, they doing good. But no, they no longer see you as an individual. They see you as the mother of them children, of them kids. So it's how the kids doing, right? Not how you doing, how the kids doing, right? And over time, some mothers start to internalize the belief that who they are matters less than what they produce for others. So as long as their kids in the house and as long as they being a mom, then the only thing they internalize is I'm a mom, right? But they forget that before mom, you were a person and that you're still a person, right? One of the quietest pains in motherhood is grieving versions of yourself that you no longer feel accessible, right? Not because motherhood ruined your life, but because when you become a constant caregiver, right, it leaves no room for reflection, right, for creativity and personal expansion, because you're on parent mode, you're on mommy mode, right? You can't, it's hard. You ever notice why, you hear people say, well, once you had them kids, you can no longer do this. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means it makes it difficult because your focus becomes more about the kids. And now you don't see yourself as that creative. Now you don't see yourself as the person that dreamed to do this, because now you see yourself as a function. I'm them kids' mom. Right? I'm them kids' mom. Whatever they need me to be, that's what I become. I'm the soccer mom. Now you're no longer identifying with the woman who dreams, the woman who has a vision. Now you're looked at as that's so and so's mom, right? Some women miss that freedom, right? Some women miss the silence. If you got a whole bunch of kids running around screaming in the house, I'm sure you have moments where you miss being able to be quiet. Before you was in a corner because you was in trouble. Now you want to go in a corner to hide from your kids. I remember I saw this video where it was on TikTok, I believe, when this mom had took a jacket and she put it over her head, over the at the bottom of the staircase where they normally hang the jackets. She hid up under the jackets just to be able to have some still time, some silence. Some women miss the spontaneity, being able to get up and go when they want to, right? Some women miss that emotional space, that emotional space where they were able to think. Now you have to be more creative. Now you have to, it doesn't mean that you can't still have it, but now you might your emotional space might be in the car when you drop them off to school, or when you're on your way to the store, you start thinking about everything. That becomes your emotional space, right? And a lot of women feel guilty for admitting that, right? But grief and gratitude can exist together, right? You can deeply love your children and still mourn parts of your previous life. And I'm not talking about parts of your of your partying life, but mourning parts of your previous life where you remembered who you were, you remembered the dreams that you had, and you remember the ambition that you have, right? Many mothers, right, spiritually exhaust themselves trying to become everything for everyone, They pray for everybody. They carry everybody. They support everyone. They the one to do all the encouraging, while quietly feeling spiritually dry themselves, right? And this creates a dangerous cycle because you begin to pour from an empty place, right? While convincing everybody else that it's strength, right? You start causing people to think that, oh, this is, you are dry, you are drained, you haven't had any place to ground and replenish and reset, but you want people to think that you're strong and that this is exemplifying strength, when actually spiritually exhausted mothers often experience emotional numbness. They experience disconnection. Like I said earlier, your kids could be talking and you don't hear nothing they saying. You just zoned out. That's where that come from. Your kids be like, "Ma," you be like, "Huh, ma, ma." You just emotionally numb. You disconnected, right? Because you feel guilty for needing time to yourself. You feel guilty for resting, and this is one of the hardest conversations to have with moms sometimes, because some mothers unconsciously develop what I consider a martyr identity. You suffer, right? Where your suffering becomes attached to your worthiness. So the more exhausted you feel, the more valuable you feel. The more you neglect yourself, the more good you feel, the more good you feel like you are. You feel like you a great mom, you feel more valued as a mom, right? And what happens is this mindset is dangerous. And I'll tell you why, because rest starts to feel selfish. Then you start feeling wrong for setting boundaries. And then you start feeling guilty for wanting help and needing help, right? It starts to feel uncomfortable. Then self-care starts to feel like something you deserve, right? So I'm going to talk about what healthy motherhood looks like, right? Because healthy motherhood is not depletion. It includes emotional honesty. It includes a support system. You need to be honest. I'm tired today. I don't feel like cooking. Go in there and eat some cereal. Go eat some cereal. Go make you a sandwich, right? Sometimes healthy motherhood includes support systems. Hey, I need a break. Can you come get the kids for the weekend? I'm tired, Sometimes it includes boundaries, right? Saying no today, I'm going to sleep in today. I'm not going to do nothing but sleep. Sometimes it includes rest. I don't care what time of the day is. I will go to sleep on you in a minute at 1:00 in the afternoon and act like nobody else exists. I will get me some sleep, right? Healthy motherhood looks like identity preservation. And what I mean by identity preservation, meaning that you realize that your worth is not in what you do, but it's in who you are, right? Healthy motherhood also includes personal development. You got to take time to pour into you, right? It includes nourishment, spiritual nourishment. What are you listening to? What are you absorbing? What are you taking in on a day-to-day basis? Because children don't only need a sacrificing mother. They also need a mentally healthy mother, right? They need an emotionally regulated mom, right? They need a spiritually connected mom. They need you to be present. So even when you're in those moments where you feel aggravated and you are in them honest moments where you feel like, dang, I just can't deal with this, they need to see how you emotionally regulate when you're frustrated. Because even though I want to hit you upside the head and knock you down somewhere, I'm going to go pray, right? Or I'm going to go walk away, right? They need to see that you can become emotionally regulated, right? Many mothers don't only need rest physically, but they need permission psychologically, right? They need permission to stop proving love through suffering, right? You don't have to prove how much you love your kids by always suffering for them, right? You don't need permission to ask for help. You don't need permission to reclaim your identity. You don't need permission to rest without guilt. You don't need permission to feel honest about how you feel. And you don't need permission to exist outside of productivity. You don't always have to be doing to experience, to have permission psychologically, right? Because motherhood was never meant to consume a woman's entire humanity, right? It was not meant to consume your entire humanity. It is what you do for a season. And it's one of the things I've said to I said this to a couple of mothers, how enjoy your kids while they're young, because one day they're going to grow up. And one day you're going to realize that I am more than a mom. One day you're going to realize when your kids are gone that if you haven't taken time to pour into yourself, if you haven't taken time to for personal development and to learn about who you are and your identity in Christ, you're gonna have an identity crisis, not a midlife crisis. You're gonna have an identity crisis because you spent all of your years pouring into children and you haven't taken time to nurture you and you haven't taken time to water you, right? So one of the greatest tragedies in motherhood is when a woman becomes so needed by everybody else that she becomes unreachable to her own self, right? She no longer remembers what really brings her joy, what she desires, and who she is outside of her responsibilities. I remember my sister-in-law said to me one time, like, now this is the opportunity for you to get to do some things that you like. And sometimes we don't always know what we like because we've spent all of our time operating in a position of motherhood that we forget our own desires. That's why when people ask you where you want to go to eat, you like, I don't know. What you want to do, I don't know. I don't know. Because your whole entire goal, your whole entire life, or your whole entire time as you were parenting, you wrapped your entire world around their world, and now you have not. Now that they have grown and left the house, now you don't know who you are outside of being a soccer mom. You don't know who you are outside of being the PTA mom, right? But healing begins the moment that you realize that your value is not measured by how much pain you can endure silently, that you deserve care, you deserve support, and you deserve rest too, right? And you also deserve to remain fully human while loving deeply. You can be honest about how you feel and still love your children very much, right? So I hope this blessed you. This was something that I wanted to say for something I wanted, just an encouraging word for the moms that are out there. I just wrote this book. I did a special offer because I have a Facebook group called Sisterhood Checkin community. And there I have over close to 500 women that are part of that group. And I am doing something special, right? Just for the moms that are part of that group. And if you want to join in on that special, my new book, Rich Woman, Poor Woman, Torn Between Two Mentalities, is going to be released on Mother's Day. So what I'm doing is allowing women that want to take part and want to be able to get the ebook version of this. I am doing a special offer where you can get the ebook for $3.99, 130 pages of wisdom on what happens when you operate from a rich woman and a poor woman mentality. Torn between mentalities, meaning that one minute you might feel like you're on top of the world, while at the same time you might feel like you're operating in certain habits that put you in a position of a poor woman. And this book has been, I've been wanting to write this book for 10 years, and I finally got a chance to be able to write this. So if you guys want to join in on the special, the ebook special for, this is a Mother's Day gift from me to you. If you're a mother, or you know somebody that can use this book and can be a blessing, make sure you go to www.richwomanpoorwoman.com and download the book. You can get an ebook version for $3.99, right? This is a special that I'm doing for Mother's Day for women that want to be able to read the book and be able to get the encouragement and want to be able to bless somebody else, right? Because after that, the physical book is going to be $20. If you want the physical book, it's $19.95, and you can go to nadiralewis.com and purchase the book yourself. But if you want to be like many others that are part of the Sisterhood Checkin community and want the ebook version of Rich Woman, Poor Woman, Torn Between Two Mentalities, if you want to receive the ebook copy, you can go to www.richwomanpoorwoman.com. And let me just read something from it to kind of give you a little snippet. Let me give you a little snippet. This is something that I've had to. This just the first page is a blessing. I'm gonna read you a little bit from it. So, page 1, the introduction, it says, "The War Within, Why I Wrote This Book, and the Question That Changed My Life." The question I'm referring to is what if, right? There was a war inside of me long before there was even a book. Not a war with people, not a war with life, a war within myself. A war between two versions of me. One version of me knew how to survive, and she knew how to carry pain and still function. She knew how to endure disappointment and keep moving. She knew how to make something out of nothing. She knew how to stretch, sacrifice, and survive. She knew how to be strong for everybody else. But beneath that strength was exhaustion. Beneath that survival was fear. Beneath that endurance was a woman who had learned how to live beneath her potential because survival had taught her to settle. And then there was another woman inside of her, a woman I could feel, but had not fully met. A woman who believed there was more. A woman who wanted healing, not just survival. A woman who wanted wholeness, not just functioning. A woman who wanted peace, discipline, wisdom, obedience. A woman who knew God didn't create her just to struggle through life. That was the war. The poor woman and the rich woman were not poor and rich according to the world standards, but poor and rich in mentality. Because poverty is deeper than money. Poverty can exist in your thinking, in your identity, in your expectations, even in your belief systems. A person can have money and still think poor. And a person can have very little and still carry the mind of abundance because their trust is rooted in God. This is why I wrote the book. Because many people are living in a battle between who they became through life and who God intended them to become through truth. The poor woman says, stay small, stay safe. Don't risk, don't trust, don't dream big, don't expect too much, don't believe for more. But the rich woman says, heal, grow, trust God, build, steward, obey, become. Romans 12:12 says, let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. That scripture changed how I understood transformation. And one thing I realized is that God changes lives by changing our mindset. And changing your mindset is what changes your life. I wrote this book because I know what it feels like to be torn between two mentalities. I know what it means to love God and still struggle with fear. I know what it means to believe in purpose but wrestle with insecurity. I know what it means to carry vision but battle limitations. I know what it means to know that there is more in you while fighting the habits that keep you small. And one question kept confronting me. What if? What if I healed? What if I obeyed? What if I trusted God? What if I stopped making decisions out of fear? What if I became disciplined? What if I stopped surviving and start stewarding? What if I became the woman of God that God saw all along? That question changed everything for me because I never thought I was better than anyone else. I never looked at people and thought I was above them. I simply looked at my life and asked, what if there's more? What if God has more? What if I am capable of more? What if my pain is not punishment? What if my pain was preparation? What if my life can become proof that healing, wisdom, and obedience can change everything? That question awakened the rich woman in me. Not rich in ego, but rich in wisdom, rich in faith, rich in discipline, rich in identity, rich in stewardship, rich in purpose. Proverbs 4:7 says, get wisdom. Getting wisdom is the wisest thing that you can do. Wisdom truly is wealth. Obedience is wealth. Healing is also wealth, right? Peace is wealth. Discipline is wealth. Identity is wealth. God is wealth. This book is an invitation. It's an invitation to confront the poor woman within and to understand her, right? To heal her and to stop letting her lead and to awaken the rich woman within you. The woman who trusts God. The woman who builds wisely. The woman who breaks old agreements. The woman who stops apologizing for growth. Stop apologizing for growing. Stop apologizing for thinking differently. Stop apologizing. Oh, got a little little strand. Stop apologizing for growing and for thinking differently, right? Be the woman who walk in purpose, the woman who understands that becoming, that's holy too. And as you read the pages of this book, my prayer is that you see yourself clearly. Not through pain, not through fear, not through irritation, but through truth. Because there may be some things about you that people may say that are factual. But aren't you glad that not everything that's factual is actual truth? Right? Facts can change. Truth doesn't change. Facts can. Right? Because the truth is this: you may have survived many things, but survival is not your final identity. There's more in you. There's wisdom in you. There is wealth in you. There is healing in you. There's purpose in you. And there's a rich woman waiting to rise in you. This book is for her. And maybe, just maybe, she's been waiting for you. So that's the introduction to Rich Woman, Poor Woman. It is an amazing book, guys. I'm telling you. Make sure you go to www.richwomanpoorwoman.com and learn. And I'll tell you some of the topics. I mean, it's just there's so much. I don't want to give you too much because I really want you to enjoy it. But it's 130 pages. And I talk about everything from how God is your source and how fear kept me safe but stuck, right? How I never thought I was better than anyone. Let me address that. That's a chapter that I talked about in this book. I never thought I was better than anyone. Because sometimes when you're growing, sometimes when you are learning, sometimes when you're learning new habits and you're being exposed to some things, sometimes people that are used to you walking in a certain mindset tend to look at you as thinking that you think you better than, right? And my question was never that. My problem was never with people. It was always with what if God had more? What would my life be if I exposed myself to different environments, right? Not necessarily to just gain monetary stuff, but to have a different mindset. Because one of the things I learned about having a rich woman mentality in this book, according to the examples that I use in this book, is that you realize that the creativity that God is giving you keeps pouring. That you're not limited you're only limited when you have the poor woman's mentality, which means you start to feel like that everything that you give is it. There's no pouring. But when you have that rich woman mentality, that means God He trusts you with stewardship. He's always pouring on the inside of you, right? So if you were blessed by this, make sure you go support me and go to www.richwomanpoorwoman.com and get the digital copy of the book for $3.99 and buy one for you. Send it to somebody else that you know that needs this, that has that same mentality, that just needs to see that there's hope, right? That needs to see that there's more, right? So that's all for now. Thank you guys for watching. I'm getting ready to head out. Peace.